Hello and welcome back to the CiP conference this afternoon. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Teo Susnjak. He's an associated professor in computer science and information technology at Massey University. Is that how you pronounce it? In New Zealand. His research encompasses machine learning and artificial intelligence, with a focus on large language models and generative AI. So please welcome Professor Teo Susnjak.
Thank you, Gordana. Welcome back, everybody, after lunch. So yesterday, Professor Nate raised a question. This was following Don's presentation. And correct me if I'm wrong, the gist was, why is chronic Lyme not recognized as much as it is? And Don, I thought, gave a really good answer. The answer was along the lines of, well, there's a lot of conflicting evidence out there, and you can come to any conclusion that you want, given the evidence that's out there. So what I want to do is, that particular question and answer dovetails perfectly to this piece of research, which is going to look at the last 25 years of debate, academic literature that's been published on this particular topic. Now, I need to first of all acknowledge my three fantastic undergrad students, Cole, Tatiana, and Nazgul, who helped me a lot. They're my data science students. And of course, our gracious hosts, Leona and Kunal, who provided both the guidance, the critical validation for the study, as well as the subject expertise, which I, as a computer scientist, certainly don't have. Okay, so no conflicts of interest to declare. Now, learning objectives. This debate about chronic Lyme disease has been raging for decades. It's not new. And what I'd like to sort of accomplish and hopefully achieve with you guys as a learning objective is for you to be able to describe the contours of this controversy, this debate over the last 25 years. Number one, the trends, the main themes that have emerged, and how these themes have evolved over time. Now, adjacent to those three things, and this is particularly important, is I'd like you to be able to appreciate or explain what kinds of evidences have shaped what becomes accepted knowledge pertaining to this controversy. Number two is, this is an abortive study. We actually tried to do this about 5 years ago, and we didn't succeed. And the reason why we didn't succeed was we didn't have the right technology in place to be able to do this. This is the first time where we can actually do what we want to do and what we achieved in the study. The algorithms that we had in place 5 years ago were mostly sentiment analysis tools for large-scale content analysis. And that's a very blunt instrument for trying to do this kind of analysis, for which requires a lot more nuance. What we're now able to do is what's called stance analysis or stance detection. We're able to detect the viewpoint of a particular author given a particular text. And this is really relevant for this controversy. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll be able to say something about the methodology that we used. And hopefully if it's applicable to you as a researcher, you'll have the confidence to actually lean on these technologies, which are wonderful these days for doing these kinds of analyses. This last one is overambitious, and I feel like I've slightly mispitched this learning objective. As a computer scientist, I got a little bit too excited, and it's not going to be a disaster if I gloss over this. This is to do with the limitations of the study, and I'm going to do something that's maybe a little bit controversial. I'm going to make a bold claim. Who knows what prompt engineering is? So hands up if you know what prompt engineering is. Hands up. Good, okay, one. So prompt engineering is this voodoo art of writing prompts to get the large language models to do what you want it to do. All right. So I'm going to say that prompt engineering is dead. So within a year or so, that's going to be done and dusted. And if you're researching, you want to leverage these technologies to automate and do large-scale meta-analyses, systematic literature reviews, you'll need different tools. And I'm going to point you to what those tools are, those emerging technologies. I am going to gloss over it, but I prepared some specific materials for you that I'm going to provide as links. And I'm happy to send these slides to you as well as all the references so that you can utilize this. I've got code examples for you. All right. So what's the disagreement? What's the heart of it? Well, on one side, we have a camp that believes that for those 25% or 30%, up to 30%, as Kunal showed in his presentation, of patients who have ongoing persistent symptoms post-treatment, we have one side that claims that these are merely due to some sort of immune system after effects, perhaps dysregulation. And they kind of put a broad term to these conditions as post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. On the other side of the argument, the opposing camp argues that no, there is most likely an ongoing persistent infection, and patients need to have recourse to potentially extended antibiotic treatments, amongst other things. All right, so that's the heart of it. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is whose voice and evidence gets heard in this. And in terms such as power dynamics is what gets thrown around. As it turns out, most medical institutions, the ones that issue clinical guidelines, as well as all the top journals from infectious diseases, biomed, they tend to lean PTLDS. They tend to believe that there is no ongoing infection. And as it turns out, and many of you already know this, and I've heard this firsthand, it's very difficult for you to publish papers that are on the side of chronic Lyme disease. So one side seems to have a much larger platform than the other. Now, if this were just an academic squabble, then who cares? But unfortunately, caught up in the middle of this, as we've heard harrowing testimonies yesterday, are patients who are not getting diagnosed and are not necessarily getting the treatment that they need. And so they're caught up in this limbo. All right, so for me as an outsider, as a computer scientist looking in, this is the key question that helps me to define the two camps. And how you answer this question really decides whether you're on the chronic Lyme disease side or the PTLDS. So this is the question: can the Borrelia bacterium genuinely survive an initial standard course of antibiotic treatment, then manage to evade detection by conventional biomedical tests, and persist as a chronic active infection that causes debilitating symptoms for months or for years? This is the question. That's the heart of the question. And how you answer this question profoundly shapes how you diagnose your patient, how you treat your patient, how you view the ongoing symptoms of your patient, and ultimately for the patient themselves, the whole experience and potential to get a cure and right treatment. So I'm going to skip over this and I'm going to jump straight into the methods. Okay, so I'm going to show you the schematic of what we used in terms of analyzing this. So there are 4 steps, and I'll try and fly over this relatively quickly. So the first part was data acquisition. We acquired 85,000 abstracts in this step. We then filtered those 85,000 and we arrived at 8,000 potential studies for further analysis. We then handcrafted very specific prompts for large language models, and we leaned on the large language models to process those 8,000 and to essentially find for us the most relevant studies to this particular controversy. And we ended up with 1,033 studies. What we then did was, we then needed to do stance detection on these studies. We needed to know, are they neutral? Are they pro-CLD or are they pro-PTLDS? We spent about a month and a half crafting this massive prompt, which you can actually define as a program, to give the large language models all the information, all the knowledge that it needs in order to assign this classification to each one of those studies. We then ran this again through a process called self-reflection that gives the large language model a chance to improve and correct its classifications. Now, once we ended up with all the classifications, the question was, is this even accurate? So what we embarked on was a comprehensive validation step. And for this, we used our in-house experts. We had 2 human experts that essentially served as our alternative raters to see how accurate this was. We randomly sampled 100 abstracts, and we got Leona and Kunal to independently classify each study based on those 3 classifications. And then we looked to see, well, what was the inter-rater reliability between the human raters and the large language models this way, as well as the inter-rater reliability between the 2 human raters. So what we got was, for the Cohen's kappa, for the humans compared to the large language model, range between 0.51 and 0.58. Now, what does that say? That indicates moderate to substantial agreement. Now, for this kind of a task, this is perfectly acceptable. This is a coding task. This is a classification task. This is absolutely acceptable according to literature. Now, for me, the clincher was, because these are just numbers and you don't really know, well, how good is it really? For me, the clincher was when we looked to see how much did the 2 humans agree with one another. And as it turned out, it was lower. So this was, for me at least, a real strong confirmation that we've got a methodology, we have got results that are reliable, we can do and we can run with this. The last thing that we did was we looked at thematic classification. So what we did was we looked at all of these abstracts that we identified and we extracted from them themes. We asked 3 completely different large language models from different commercial providers. That means they're trained on different data, they have different biases, different ways of viewing things. And we asked them, find us up to a dozen themes that emerge out of all of this text. And as it turned out, they all came up with 8 themes, slightly worded differently, but they all mapped perfectly with one another. What we then did was we mapped each one of the abstracts to 2 themes, right? And we used large language models to do that. And then we also validated that classification. We had 96% accuracy when we got a human expert to validate those classifications on a random sample. So we were confident we had the right results. We can then proceed. So what were those results? Let's start off really high level, and then we're going to drill down into the meat of the analysis. So overall, across 25 years of this debate, this is the picture that emerges. 42% of the studies, the plurality, was neutral. So what does that say? Well, I guess it indicates there is a lot of doubt. There is complexity. Perhaps there's unwillingness to lean on either side as well. There could be strategic choosing to be neutral as well. When the researchers did choose a stance, a position, a tilt, then predominantly it was PTLDS, right? So 34% versus 24%. Now, when we look at this across time, what's happened across the last 25 years in terms of absolute numbers of studies that are published and the positions, the stances that they lean towards, what we see is, if you look at the top 2, the blue is the neutral and the orange is pro-PTLDS. We see that they have been increasing. probably substantially faster from about 2010 onwards. Down the bottom, pro-CLD stance increasing as well, but certainly not as quickly as the other two. Now, when we normalize these numbers into percentages, so percentages per year with respect to stance, I'll draw your attention first of all to the top one here. All right, so here what we did was we smoothed this time series to eliminate the noise and just focus on the signal. And so this is the neutral position. We can see that around 2000, it was just over 30% of the studies were neutral. Now what we're seeing is it's about 50%. At the bottom half here, what we did was we looked at the net difference. So we took the percentage of PTLDS studies minus the CLD studies, and we put a little equilibrium dashed line here to see which way is it going. And everything that's above the line is in favor of PTLDS. So what we can see is, in general, especially since 2005, we can ignore what happened before 2005 because there weren't that many studies. We can see that the general trend, I know there are ups and downs, seems to be more towards PTLDS. All right, now let's dive a little bit deeper and let's look at the themes. What you see here are the 8 themes that actually emerged from that thematic analysis using large language models. I'm going to draw your attention to the top 3 because I'm going to run out of time. And top 3 are the biggest ones. This is ranked ordered according to number of studies that fall or associated with each one of these themes. Now, the interesting thing is the first one. This is the great causal argument. Is it an active infection or is it some sort of post-infectious immune activity? Now look at this. This theme is in about 56% of the studies across 25 years. And look, this is the most polarizing theme as one would expect. Only 12% of the studies here were neutral. The rest went either way. And majority of them went PTLDS, almost 50%. The next theme down is the diagnostic complexity and the uncertainty around it. Now, here we go, we flick all the way around. We go from the most polarized to the most ambivalent or confused. So here we see that over 3/4 of the studies were neutral. Much smaller number supported CLD and PTLDS. PTLDS was twice as much. And then when we look at the third highest theme, the third one down, which is the therapeutic controversies, we again swing back to a polarizing position where only 21% of the studies, 1/5 of the studies were neutral. The rest were pretty much evenly split between pro-PTLDS and CLD. So for me, this was interesting because we can see a causal chain emerging from this. What we can see is, and there's no clear test, it's uncertain diagnosis, disputed cause, and then a divided treatment. Now, what we did with that data is we now looked at it through the perspective of time and shifts across time. So we wanted to see how these themes changing across the decades. And the interesting things are the first one, the controversy around active infection versus post-infectious immune activity, started off 33%, early 2000s, but it's going downwards. So only about 1/4 of the studies now are focusing on this theme. I believe this is a positive light in this data. The diagnostic complexity, this is the one that has the highest amount of confusion, ambivalence, complexity. This is the one that's trending upwards. So there is more focus heading in this direction, and that's good. Therapeutic controversies seem to be going down a little bit more, but the other one that was noteworthy is the patient-centered experiences and advocacy research. That's going up. It's still small compared to the others, but it started off with 3% of the studies, and now it actually comprises 10. So that's good. All right. Now let's delve a little bit deeper into these themes. And what I want to now answer is the question of what kinds of evidence shape what becomes accepted knowledge. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this active infection versus post-infectious immune activity. And let's look at it through the lens of what kind of evidence supports these positions. So this is what we see. We've got 4 broad groups. Not sure if you can see the x-axis. We've got on the left-hand side, we have the clinical evidence. So here we've got bundled together RCTs, we've got observational studies. Then in the next category, we've got laboratory work, animal, and the last one is going to be your meta-analyses, systematic literature reviews, and the guidelines. The interesting thing is there's a different fingerprint for different sides of the argument. And that's interesting. So we see, while it's not too clear, still the majority of the studies that support PTLDS tend to be clinical. The interesting thing is once we look at the meta-analyses and the guidelines, it is much stronger favoring the PTLDS side. The literature that seems to support most the CLD case is the laboratory work, the mechanistic studies in vitro and so forth. So that's the evidence that seems to be supporting each side of the argument, at least for this particular theme. Now, I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into this last theme, and that's the therapeutic controversies and antibiotic efficacy. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper and break down the clinical evidence into more granular breakdowns. So what we have here, if you haven't seen this kind of a graph before, I'm just going to break it down for you very quickly. So we grouped all the studies based on RCT, observational, case reports, lab imaging, and so forth. Now, keep your eye on the dashed line. If any dot falls to the right of the dashed line and the confidence windows are to the right, that means that particular evidence domain supports that particular position. So anything to the right of that line means pro-PTLDS, anything to the left is pro-CLD. Now, for me, the extraordinary thing or interesting thing was that I noticed here is if we look down the bottom, all the RCTs, just about, the majority of it, falls and points supports the PTLDS argument. And if you look at the meta-analyses and the review guidelines, it's N122, heavily supporting PTLDS at the exclusion of most of the other clinical studies, observational studies that are on the other side of CLD. So case reports, lab studies, and so forth. So I need to wrap this up quickly. But I want to show you very quickly that there is also bias in terms of publications. Most of the big journals, we're talking infectious diseases, we're talking American Journal of Medicine, Clinical Infectious Diseases, the Journal of Immunology, they all tend PTLDS, all right? So anything that's going that way is pro-PTLDS. Anything on this side is pro-CLD. And the ones that are pro-CLD are more sort of the niche journals. They are open access. They are perhaps ones that are more open to hypotheses. And so there's a differential, a huge structural asymmetry in terms of what voices get heard. Right, I'm going to need to wrap things up. So in closing, I would say there is an epistemic asymmetry. And epistemic, by that we mean is how we arrive at what we know. All right, we've got methodological filtering that is going on that decides what studies get into critical meta-analyses, which are used by medical institutions for clinical guidelines. These are the types of studies that certain journals, the ones with a loud microphone, prefer. And that profoundly shapes how two different sides come to a different conclusion on this very controversial topic. All right, so I'm going to wrap things up. These links that I created for you, I'm happy to send you the slides. Check it out. It is code. Thank you, Leona. Thank you, Kunar, for all that you've done. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Great. Okay. Just, I wanted to listen at the beginning as well, but the neutral, so if within that, and I've also did any analysis in that, within the neutral category, are there any that acknowledge the coexistence of chronic disease and post-treatment syndrome?
Yeah. Yeah, so in short, no. So it was 1,033 studies. So it's a lot of studies to sort of go through and try and see what's going on in them. So no, we relied on large language models to come up with the classification. That each classification did come up with the reasons. So we could actually go back and pull out the reasoning as to why it came up with a particular classification. But no, I didn't quite delve into that. Yeah, we certainly could. Yes.
Did you ever find any cases where the abstract was different from the actual content of the article? Because that is sometimes the case.
Yeah, so that is one of the limitations, and I didn't quite get time to discuss. Obviously, this work has a limitation. We couldn't download 1,033 papers, right? That's a massive undertaking. That's going to be possible soon, but at the moment it wasn't possible. So yes, there are possibly going to be some discrepancies between how an abstract is interpreted and what is actually in the body, the text of the manuscript itself. So that could happen, absolutely.
So we have two from online. The first one is, which journals have the largest audience?
Oh, which journals have the largest audience? So I can. So this wasn't so much by audience, but how do I do this? So we have, this is journals by volume. All right, so this is journals by volume rather than by audience in terms of impact factor. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Tal has a question. So Dr. Tal, can you speak?
Thank you so much. So this was super interesting, and I'm just wondering, there was a big trend shift during the pandemic to switch to using the term IACI, infection-associated chronic illnesses, that could kind of capture long COVID and chronic Lyme and bucket all these things together. And I'm wondering how that would have factored into the, post 2020
Yeah.
articles and where that kind of would have fallen in this distinction.
Yeah. So I guess what we're hoping for is that in this stage here where we did filtering from 85,000, which would have captured some of those studies that weren't necessarily relevant, here, when we went from 85,000 to 8,000, all the studies needed to have a discussion or focus on Lyme disease only. And so the hope is that the large language models, which we gave very, very specific instructions to, and we gave it examples of what kinds of abstracts to include, will have filtered this out correctly.
Okay, great, thank you.